Good afternoon. Welcome to the IPDAY webinar, High Impact Indicators Across the Content Areas, a Thematic Approach, Part 2, Reasoning Through Language Arts, Science, and Mathematical Reasoning. This training event is supported with federal funds as appropriated to the Florida Department of Education, Division of Career and Adult Education for the provision of state leadership professional development activities. My name is Ann Morgan, and I'm the Adult Education Coordinator and AGE Grant Manager for Pinellas County Schools CTAE Department. I'm very excited to be with you today to discuss our topic. This will actually be part 2 of this webinar series on using a thematic approach to focus on related indicators on the GED exam and TABE 11 and 12. If you missed the first part, you can find it on the IPDAY website dated November 14th, 2018. A little housekeeping. You should be able to see our question and answer screen. If you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A box, and I will answer them as we go along if I can, and also at the end of the presentation. Today's presentation is being recorded, so encourage your colleagues to access it on the IPDAY website. It should be available within 48 hours. What you should be able to access now is a printable copy of the PowerPoint, the webinar workbook with some of today's activities, and an integrated thematic lesson plan. Evidence is everywhere, with an activity from each of the 4 GED content areas. That is also now posted on the IPDAY website. Today's objectives. Since we are now implementing TABE 11 and 12, the amount of curriculum we are asking our teachers to cover has increased dramatically as we integrate the CCR standards into our ABE teaching. This new material, added to the higher rigor of the GED 2014 exam, has made it necessary for teachers to try using an approach that incorporates multiple skill and content areas into their daily instruction. In the webinar today, we will learn about the process we're using in Pinellas County, a thematic approach to teaching the high impact indicators with related indicators. In this second session, we will explore how we were able to expand the usefulness and effectiveness of this process to teach related standards and objectives from ABE language, reading and math, with similar GED indicators in science and mathematical reasoning. We will also see how you can combine activities from all 4 content areas of the GED exam in a seamless thematic unit on evidence. You know, of course, one of the best parts of any IPDAY webinar are the resources you receive to share with colleagues. So we'll talk about those at the end also. First steps in that thematic approach, you have to select a theme or skill that's relevant and necessary to student success. Last time, in part 1, we identified locating, evaluating, and analyzing evidence in a passage, prompt, or text as our thematic focus for that series of lessons and activities. We will continue with that theme for part 2. For this webinar, we will examine the college and career readiness standards that relate to TABE 11 and 12 math, the RLA high impact indicator identified by the GED testing service, and the related indicators in the remaining areas of the GED exam, science and mathematical reasoning. As a standard practice, using informational text and sample questions from the GED test and TABE 11 and 12, which are all readily available on their websites, will ensure our resources are relevant and applicable. We also provide additional lessons and activities from relevant websites and online sources. Let's look at some GED assessment targets for science and mathematical reasoning. And you can see that top one, science practice SP4A, is evaluate whether a conclusion or theory is supported or challenged by particular data or evidence. And that follows right along with our theme of our RLA topic. The science indicator is also a high impact indicator. Next, you have the math practice 3C, improve or correct a flawed line of reasoning. This will be a great skill to sum up our thematic lesson plan. Students need to be able to identify and evaluate good evidence or data as well as faulty or less reliable reasoning. Similarly, this last one is from the TABE 11 and 12 blueprints, level D math standards, which asks students to compare probability models and explain possible sources of discrepancy. In other words, look at the data or evidence. I mentioned the high impact indicators before. Let's review quickly. You can find them on the GED website and also on IPDAY. They should be emphasized in any GED preparation you do, as they do represent the foundational skills that are the basis for the development of other skills covered in the GED assessment targets and can be applied in multiple contexts. They can be taught very easily and will certainly give you the more bang for the buck we're looking for in our limited time frame for instruction. So in our thematic lesson plan about evidence, see how the high impact indicator for RLA, which is on the left, evaluate the relevance and sufficiency of evidence offered in support of a claim, and see how it meshes with the related indicators on the right from the social studies, science, and mathematical reasoning areas. Again, evidence, correcting evidence, judging evidence, evaluating evidence. That's what our theme is, and that's why it's nice that all of these kind of mesh together in a seamless unit. So once the theme is selected, the practice to put together this thematic unit is to select related indicators, which we've done, and pull lessons and activities from each content area. And that's what we put into the lesson plan that I think you're really going to enjoy. From November 14th, this is what I referenced earlier. This was the recorded webinar with the workbook of resources, and that had the activities for the RLA high impact indicator that we've selected about evidence, and it included the social studies content area. So we've combined the activities from that first November 14th part 1 webinar on RLA and social studies with the ones that are in your workbook for part 2 on the science and mathematical reasoning, and hence that's our thematic lesson plan. So let's look and see what we used for each one of these series of activities. And I can tell you a lot of these were found very easily and free on the internet. So for the RLA, we've got a video introduction, some graphic organizers, and some sample prompts that we took from the GED testing service. For the social studies, we've got a couple of activities about assessing and analyzing fact and opinion, and also evaluating sources. We've also, for the science and social studies and RLA, we've included some thinking charts and some contact activities. And for math, to draw and support conclusions, we've included, again, a video introduction, and some content group activities. So you'll have quite a few things that you can use to talk about our Evidence is Everywhere lesson plan. So let's look at our thematic lesson plan, Evidence is Everywhere. This is posted on the website, as I said. Using the IPDAY lesson plan format, first we identify our targets, which these are the ones that I've shown you earlier. As you can see, the high impact indicator is on the right, and those related indicators are on the left. And of course, every IPDAY lesson has objectives. And again, these are the ones that we've been looking at, integrating high impact indicators with related indicators from other content areas, identify, assess, and analyze types of evidence in a claim or passage, defining facts and opinions and reasoned judgment and evaluating sources in a document, assessing evidence and evaluating its sufficiency to support a conclusion, and identifying the faulty line of reasoning and improving or correcting it. In your lesson plan, we've included a great graphic organizer describing types of evidence. We also talked about this in the first webinar. Let's talk about the different types of evidence in this graphic. At its most basic, evidence is something that can be perceived with the senses. I think almost all the students will be familiar with factual evidence. Those are the things they can pick up pretty quickly. They've got the data, they've got different things like that that are kind of pop right out at students. The only caveat here is sometimes students can confuse facts and claims. That's because facts can be claims in one context or start out as claims, and once proven with evidence, they become facts. Happens a lot in science and hypothesis in the scientific method. In a well-written extended response, you can usually tell the difference between a claim and the factual evidence used to support it. So students are pretty good at that. Another type of evidence, statistics or data. Again, those are your numbers, your percentages, your measurement. Examples or anecdotes, real-life experiences is another type. Expert testimony. Most of the students will be familiar with this. Specialized knowledge. Logical reasoning, which again kind of draws on that science or mathematical area. And lastly, that emotional appeal. And again, there's a really good video in your lesson plan for the science that talks about emotional appeal. And they actually have a couple of dog commercials. One, where the dogs are in cages and these horrible things are happening to them. And then, if you buy their dog food, they're going to contribute money. And then the other one is one that just talks about how great the food is and the nutrition that's in it and everything. So it's a good kind of a conversation starter for your students to show them what emotional appeal can be like. It's really hard to watch that one with the animals in the cages, I can tell you. So it's a good video to include in your lesson. So what we also did in the lesson plan and in your workbook, I got a passage from the GED testing service. There's several of these, and it's under the free classroom resources section. This particular passage is in the RLA section under extended response, tools, and practice. And there's, I think, about 7 or 8 different ones in there where they give you 2 sources. And then, of course, there's a prompt, and it asks students to take the evidence and which claim is better supported. But what we're doing here is just to start out, and this is a good one too when you have students who are just kind of learning about taking out evidence and using a graphic organizer. We're just going to take one of the passages, the one from the source material, number 2. We're going to have the student read the passage, highlight types of evidence that they find. Then, using the chart that we just talked about, we have them fill that in and with the evidence that they found. I actually selected the source material too because it has a lot more of the data, statistics and percentages and things that would be easier for students to pick out in their first go around. So after you have all the students do that, you kind of go over what you found. And in the lesson plan and the workbook, we've included that graphic that's filled out. So you've got some samples here. This would be a good first activity, as I said. Now, to modify instruction, once they get used to picking out evidence and you want to take them a little step further, take the other source material, which was the number 1, and using the extended response prompt, ask students to again review the evidence from both samples. And we've got some great graphic organizers in that webinar workbook from part 1 that allows them to put one on each side and then ask them to compare which one is better supported. Another extension activity you could do with this is not just use those GED testing service samples, but take some real world examples from newspapers, websites like Newsella, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, have some great things, or any kind of informational text, and especially ones that would have some of the different types of evidence. As I said, maybe even some expert testimony, some emotional appeal, things like that. So there's a lot of samples out there that you could use once they get used to pulling that evidence out. This is another activity that we included in the lesson plan, but mainly talked about it during the first webinar. It's included in the lesson plan, as I said. After students complete activities on types of evidence, they may need some additional practice on differentiating between facts and opinions. Evidence can be fact, it can be opinion, it could be all sorts of things. So this particular activity is from Miami-Dade College. It was a really good one. It gave them different things, and they had to tell whether it was a fact or an opinion. And it's kind of a good thing for them to get that practice. After they've done that activity, you might want to ask them for some from their own experience. Here's a sample. Ask them which of these samples is a fact and which is an opinion. And I actually looked up one of these. According to a 2015 study, 95% of Americans now own some type of cell phone. Is that a fact or is that an opinion? Another one, cell phone use over time can make people too dependent on technology to solve all their problems, which might seem like it's more like an opinion. Several states now have laws that restrict the use of cell phones while driving, even hands-free devices. I think that's coming up in Florida pretty soon, and that would be a fact. And an opinion, cell phones are distracting and keep users from interacting on a personal level. So getting students to kind of come up with a few of their own is a good way to kind of hit that point home with them. Another activity that we included in the lesson plan is on evaluating sources. And this is a really good one from the Stanford History Group, which the website is included in your resources, in your workbook, and in the lesson plan. But this one, in order to evaluate the relevance and sufficiency of evidence, this is a great way to do it. First, you can divide students into groups and have them complete the worksheet, discuss, and review answers. I just included a couple of them here, and it's a good way to get students talking about some of these things and a good way to bring in some historical facts and background information when they're not looking, more or less. Here's your first question. Who was present at the signing of the Declaration of Independence? What would be the best source? Who would you trust more? A Hollywood movie about the American Revolution made about 2001? Or a book written by a famous historian who is an expert on the American Revolution, published in 1999. And, they can debate this. Well, one's a little more recent, but, one thing that I think probably most students might know is that historians base their accounts on multiple primary and secondary documents, extensive research. Hollywood films, on the other hand, have no standards for historical accuracy. So, I would probably go with the historian on that one. Another one, and this one I thought was kind of interesting. What was slavery like in South Carolina? Here's your first source. An interview with a former slave in 1936. The interviewer is a Black man collecting oral histories for a federal writers project. Or an interview with a former slave in 1936. The interviewer is a white woman collecting oral histories for the Federal Writers Project. Who would you trust more and why? So again, kind of asking students to think about, who would probably be a better source. The answer from Stanford was that audiences shape the stories we tell. We can imagine that even in 1936, a former slave would be wary of criticizing slavery to a government official. That's not to say that source one is necessarily accurate. We can imagine a former slave might possibly not remember details so well. But of the two sources, the Stanford History Group believed that the number one would be the right one. So there's quite a few things. But again, just a good way to kind of stimulate conversation and get students thinking about, how to evaluate sources and what would make something a little more relevant or a little more believable than something else. So in that first webinar, of course, we talked about the social studies and the RLA, and now we're on the science. This particular one that we selected about the evidence, Science Practice 4A, is also a high impact indicator like the RLA one is that we're using. But one thing when you get into some of these content areas like science or social studies, you may need to review the scientific method, for instance, for this one, and do a little background activity before you start to get into the actual forming a conclusion. It's important to note and let students know that they've already practiced this skill when they were working on the extended response. So by organizing their evidence and deciding which claim is best supported, they've already formed a conclusion. So again, on this particular thing, reviewing that scientific method will certainly help them a little bit if they can't quite remember. I also wanted you to see that how they use claims and evidence in science. This is from the My GED Study Guide, and it gives some insight into that use of science evidence on the science exam. On the science exam, you'll be presented with science passage and be asked to find evidence that supports a finding, make sense of the information. There'll be science readings about theories and drawing conclusions from evidence. You should be able to read science passages and identify the evidence that supports the theory, principle, or conclusion that's been drawn. So they gave an example, which is pretty timely this week or last week. Global climate change is a science topic that is frequently discussed in the news. Articles about this topic generally present evidence as to how humans either are or are not responsible for the changing climate. It's important for you to be able to read something about climate change and identify the evidence that the authors cite to support their conclusions. So it's good to let students know that we're not just having them do these activities for fun, they're actually going to be learning the skills that they need on the test. And again, as I mentioned, reviewing that scientific method, talking about those kind of things, don't assume students will remember all these things, especially if they haven't been in school for a while. So we've included a lot of vocabulary and things like that, and the link to the YouTube video describing the scientific method for you to show before you have them start to work on drawing a conclusion. And then speaking of prep materials, another important step is to include modifications for different levels. And every IPDA lesson plan has this segment or content within it. It always needs to include some activities for the varying levels of students in your classroom. Some students may need additional review or practice before trying activities at higher GED levels. And this lesson plan, we did include videos, as I said, as a content introduction, vocabulary, some brainstorming and class discussion questions, graphic organizers, websites to find resources that activate that background knowledge, and other things. Additionally, students often feel more confident when paired or in groups with other students. So setting up managed small groups, including higher and lower level students, will boost participation. I have a question, and from saying, I'm having technical difficulties. How can I access the handout and recording after? Well, that one I can answer. Again, on the website, within 24 hours. If you got the link to the presentation, if you can't access it that way, the PowerPoint, the workbook will be posted on the website within 48 hours. It might even be there by tomorrow. And the lesson plan is already on the IPDA website. So go to your IPDA website, log in, and under lesson plans, under resources, lesson plans, you'll see this thematic unit that we're talking about. Okay. Now I'm having a little technical difficulty. Here we go. There we go. So here's another activity for science. This is from Mr. Hill's science website. And that resource, again, is listed in your lesson plan. Lots of great resources there. This particular worksheet asks students to apply the scientific method. That's why you need to review it first, and answer questions related to the experiment posed here. This brings in some background science knowledge about Francisco Redi and his hypothesis about spontaneous generation. It's a good example for students to use to talk about drawing conclusions based on data or evidence, particularly because the evidence that Redi collected did not prove his hypothesis. So students need to know the conclusion does not always support the original idea. Once they've gathered that evidence or data, they may find out that they need to amend or revise their hypothesis. So these are a couple of questions from that. Have students work on this on their own. There's only, I think, 6 questions. And then come together as a class to go over the answers. The first question here, how did he test his hypothesis? And the answer is A, which is actually comes from the scientific method. Number 5, what was the variable in his experiment? And again, that's where that vocabulary comes in that we've got in that lesson plan. If they don't know the difference between a variable and a dependent and an independent variable, it's a good review for that. And what do you think Reddy's conclusion was? Now remember, he thought that things with spontaneous generation, things would just kind of appear. But actually, he found out that living things do come from other things. They don't just appear out of nowhere. So that in that case, Reddy was wrong in his initial hypothesis. So now let's look at that math indicator that we talked about earlier. This one was a little more difficult to line up the searching for evidence. You know, the RLA, the extended response, that's what they do. They search for evidence. They find the one that best supports the claim. The same things in science and social studies. They're looking for that data or that evidence to back up the premise that they're exploring. But math is a little more difficult. And this was the one that I found that was related that seemed to be probably the one that would lend itself the best to put into this lesson plan. Just like in the extended response, explaining and justifying are at the heart of mathematical reasoning. So for this particular lesson, we are focused on probability. We thought that was a low enough skill. Didn't want to get into, quadratic equations or anything, proving and disproving those initially. So probability was something that we thought most of them would be familiar with, and you could bring in some of your lower level students too. But you could certainly use other topics besides this one, probability. So I think I have 2 activities for this in your lesson plan. The first one was kind of an easy one, the bags of jelly beans. So first, of course, we want to ensure that the students understand the problem by asking them. Your task is to decide if the statement is true. Once you've made a decision, you need to convince me or the teacher or your partner with reasoning. So here's our first scenario. I have 2 bags, A and B. Both contain red and yellow jelly beans. There are more red jelly beans in bag A than bag B. If I choose one jelly bean from each bag, I'm more likely to choose a red one from bag A than from bag B. So they're supposed to decide, okay, they do know there's 2 bags. They both have red and yellow. The bag A has more reds than yellow. But if he chooses a jelly bean from either bag, is he more likely to choose a red one from bag A? So a couple of things that they need to know before they answer that. This actually came from a website called math and then word shell.org, full of lesson plans. I mean, there was just tons, and they go way up into quadratics and things like that. I found out the project was initially funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and developed as part of a mathematics assessment project. All the lessons on this website have been aligned to the standards. And so before starting this activity, of course, again, review probability a little bit. But here we're going to present that information as we did. So let's look at our possible answers for this. We want to ask them, do you know how many red and yellow jelly beans are in each bag? No, we don't. We just know that there's more red ones in bag 1 than bag 2. Can you think of a situation for which the statement is true? So for instance, if I choose one jelly bean, I'm more likely to get a red one from bag A. What would be a situation that would say that that was true? It would be possible if, for example, there was 2 red and 1 yellow in bag A. So there was only 3 of them. And in bag B, there was one red and one yellow. That fits all the scenarios. They both have red and yellow. There's more in bag A because there's two of them. So in that case, you probably would be more likely to get a red one because there's two of them in there. So you're doubled your chances. What about a situation for which that statement would not be true? You wouldn't be more likely to get a red one. That might be, for example, there was two reds and three yellows in bag A, and one red and one yellow in bag B. So, and then ask the class, do they have a different statement that is also true or false? So, or maybe, can they think of a probability question to share with the class? Get them to kind of bring up something that they think about. And again, they have to try and convince you with some reasoning as to why they believe it's true or false, or it could be true in this situation. It's good activity. Another one we have, which I think students find a little more fun, is the card set, true, false, or unsure. So again, there's about 10 of these on there. And again, from the mathshell.org website, it's a collaborative activity. So it's good to put students in a group, at least a pair, but could even be a larger group. You can use number cubes for this activity, but other of these questions can be answered with just a basic knowledge of probability concepts. We've included two here, but there's more in the workbook, as I said. You know, using manipulatives a lot of times will bring this activity up a notch, and students will be a little more engaged. So first, you have each team or pair use reasoned judgment and try and answer the question without using the number cubes. And they need to justify their answers with data, a diagram, a chart, or reasonable explanation. Remember that math practice 3 that we're focusing on, constructing viable arguments and critiquing the reasoning of others. And for our indicator for the lesson was improving the flawed reasoning. So this is a good activity. So example A here, if you roll a 6-sided cube and it lands on a 6 more than any other number, then the number cube must be biased. Now, is that faulty reasoning? This statement addresses the misconception that probabilities give the proportion of outcomes that will occur. The answer here is actually false. With more evidence, how many times was the cube rolled? How many more 6s were thrown? More advanced mathematics could be used to calculate the probability that the number cube is biased, but you could never be 100% certain. So in example F, scoring a total of 3 with 2 number cubes is twice as likely as scoring a total of 2. Now this one I had to kind of think about this for a minute. This particular statement addresses the misconception that 2 outcomes are equally likely. The answer actually here is true. To score the number 3, there's 2 possible outcomes. You could have 1 and a 2, or you could roll a 2 and a 1. But to score a 2 with 2 number cubes, there's only one outcome, a 1 on the one number cube and a 1 on the other. So the probability would be twice as likely that you would throw a 3 with 2 cubes than a 2. So again, they talk about it, then they try it a few times and get a little practice in. And again, at least it's getting them moving a little bit and thinking about some things in a different way. Another big part of any lesson plan, of course, is the debriefing, and you'll always find those in the IPDAY lessons. Here we had a few sample debriefing questions to bring it all back together. Again, going back to that first thing that we talked about, types of evidence. Define different types of evidence. Ask them again to give an example of something that they've seen recently on their cell phones or on television that has an emotional appeal. Give a real-world example of a statement or factual evidence versus one with an emotional appeal. What's the difference between a fact and opinion? And have them give you a couple of samples as we did earlier. Describe some evidence you could use to evaluate the validity or truthfulness of a claim. Describe the possible outcomes in evaluating evidence to form a conclusion. And how can you correct a faulty line of reasoning or assess data in a math problem? So good thing to kind of finish up with getting them to remember what we were doing here today. And so where can you get some activities and that will give students practice in this very important skill? Again, located on your IPDA website and in your workbooks for both Part 1 and Part 2 are websites that house a wealth of additional practice videos and activities you can use. I've checked all these out, and they seem to be pretty good. Since these are all aligned to Common Core college and career readiness standards that are utilized everywhere, there's already created lessons ready for you to use. So you can do that at your leisure. So to review, what we've talked about today is using those high impact indicators. And I really can't stress that enough. I know I've probably said it 20 times in the last 25 minutes, but they really are great ways to get a lot of instruction and to really hit those skills without having to teach every single skill. Especially when you can identify that common thread that's found in those related indicators. And if you go on the GED testing service website, you'll see they have the graphic of all the high impact indicators, and there are 21 of them for the 4 content areas. And then they also have another document that has each one of those and related indicators that teach the same skill in the other content areas. And that's what we used, of course. That's where we found these to put this thematic lesson together. You know, and one thing I found doing this, starting with the RLA, I think is really the best. It seems to set the stage to add the other related indicators more easily. Since all content areas require some reading, this is probably the best place to begin. So whether you're picking something like evidence or you're doing some other aspect that you might find on the RLA and then looking for those related indicators, it's just the great place to begin. And select texts or prompts that contain a viewpoint the author wants the reader to accept. Especially if you're starting your thematic unit with reading skills, be sure to use prompts and documents that lend themselves to easy analysis. I know I mentioned, you know, you can pull something off the newspaper, you can pull something off Newsella or News for You or one of those other websites, but don't make it more difficult for the students by picking something that doesn't have a lot of easily discovered evidence and facts and things that they can pull out, at least initially, because they need to get that practice of being able to identify that evidence, analyze that evidence, assess that evidence, and see, you know, how it's going to work for them in their extended response and answering the other questions on the other parts of the test. So I'm going to look and see. I think we might have a question here. No, and I think we already answered that question. Are there any other questions? Well, I don't see any more today. At the very end here, after our little quick survey, you're going to be able to have my contact information. So you can email me at either place, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But for now, I'm just going to sign off for just a sec and have you complete a quick survey on our give us a little feedback for today. I'm back for just a minute. I did have another question come in asking about author's tone or viewpoint. I can tell you that there's a couple of great activities on our list of websites. And actually, if you email me, I can send you the specific links to those. As I was doing my research, I did find some great resources for author's tone and viewpoint. And my contact information is on this last slide. My school email is morgan@pcsb.org, or my IPDAY, amorgan@floridaipday.org. And if you can resend me send me an email, I will send you those specific links, but there are some great links posted in your webbook. So with that, we're signing off for today, and thank you for your participation, and have a wonderful evening.